Hello, and welcome back to the At-Home Educator podcast. Hello everybody, it is Brittany here again, and before we get started on today's podcast, I wanted to make a very exciting announcement, and that is that we are officially on iTunes. So if you go to the iTunes store or to the Apple Podcast app and type in the At-Home Educator, you should be able to find the podcast and subscribe. So make sure you do that right away so you are notified every time that I upload, which, by the way, will now be every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Mountain Time because I live in New Mexico, so I'm on Mountain Time. In today's episode, we are going to tackle the best ways to run a successful online classroom. As many of you know, especially if you have a background in teaching in a brick and mortar classroom, teaching in an online classroom is a little bit of a different experience. So I've come up with 6 tips to help you keep a successful online classroom, and I'm going to tell you about them today. But you guys, before we get started, I want to have some real talk. I am really tired, guys. This whole waking up at 4 a.m. thing is really getting to me this week, and I don't know why. I think it's just because my schedule has just been fully booked. So I'm teaching like 5 back-to-back classes in the morning, and then I'm also teaching on Friday nights, and now I'm teaching on Saturday mornings. So I'm only sleeping in 1 day a week, and I know a lot of you probably get up way earlier than me and teach way more than me, so I'm probably just being a wimp about it, but I just wanted to share that I'm having a very hard time. I've been so tired and had such a bad tired brain, so if I mess up at all talking today, you know why. But if you have any coping strategies that you use to help you with your tiredness, then please let me know, because I would love to hear what you do to combat your feeling tired after teaching. We all know this is a very demanding job, and any tips that you have would be very helpful. Remember, there are 3 ways you can reach out to me. That is through Instagram, through my website, or through an email, and I will have all 3 linked in the description below. So with that being said, and with all of my mistakes taken care of, let's go ahead and dive into today's subject. So before we can talk about the 6 ways that you can keep your online classroom successful, I wanted to talk about the differences that I've seen personally transitioning from a brick and mortar classroom to an online classroom. And as a ex-brick and mortar teacher, I have noticed some changes that could pose some interesting challenges in the online setting. In a traditional classroom, you see the same students every day for the most part. So whether you were a primary school teacher or you taught secondary levels, so you switched classes, you still saw the same kids most of the time, whether it was all day or for a class period. And that is great for teaching because you kind of know what to expect. There's still a little bit of unpredictability, but you, for the most part, know what to expect. You know how to get your students excited. You know how to get them engaged, things like that. However, with an online classroom, especially with the VIPKid format, most of the time you are going to be teaching different children every day. And that brings us to the first difference between a brick and mortar classroom and an online classroom, which is predictability. So that lack of predictability with your students causes you to have to use some strategies that you might not have to use as often in the brick and mortar classroom. The first one is improvisation. And by improvisation, I mean that you kind of have to change your style of teaching every day or with every student. Whereas in a traditional classroom, you know what to expect and you might not have to improvise as often. The big thing that I've noticed is the lack of knowledge on VIPKid of a student's specific needs. In a traditional classroom, you have students that have IEPs, which are individualized education plans. And kids with IEPs, you know that they have some kind of maybe learning disability, or maybe, just something where they need some kind of specialized intervention that you need to provide to them. Whereas on VIPKid, you may have a student who might need some kind of extra help when they're learning or something like that, but there's no way for you to know that. Now, I did notice that on VIPKid, there is a section where parents can put in preferences, but for the most part, I've noticed that a lot of parents don't use that. So it's kind of pointless. So there's IEPs. In the traditional classroom, you also have conferences. So you get to talk to a student's parents before you teach them, usually at like a meet the teacher or an open house. And a lot of parents will be open about the fact that their child needs extra help or they want their child to have extra assistance. Whereas when you teach a VIPKid class, you don't have that. Their previous teachers might leave notes. So they might let you know like, oh, this student needs extra help pronouncing words or with reading, things like that. But for the most part, you don't get a lot of input before you meet a new student. And that can pose a challenge in the classroom because you're not really sure what you need to do extra for your student until you get in there and until you meet them. Another big difference between teaching in a brick and mortar classroom and teaching online, especially with ELL students or ESL students, is the cultural difference. Now, with teaching ELL students in a traditional classroom, you will have cultural differences, obviously, because a lot of these students are from a different country pretty freshly, so they're pretty fresh to America and they don't quite know all of our cultural things that we do that are a little different from them. But they are actively becoming, for the most part, Americans, so they are learning American culture. Whereas these students that you're meeting on VIPKid are living in China and just learning English to help them communicate in the future, whether they want to do business or have a pen pal, something like that. So the cultural differences between you and a student on VIPKid are going to be a lot larger than the cultural differences between you and an ELL student in the traditional classroom. And this cultural difference with your VIPKid students, I've found, can lead to some kind of like awkward moments. So maybe you're not really thinking and you use some kind of American expression and they don't quite understand it. I've had some like awkward silences. So like you'll say, I don't know, well, money doesn't go on trees. And then they'll kind of just like stare at me. And then I'm like, okay, let's move on. You're doing a great job. But, it creates some of those awkward moments. There are actually some interesting differences between American culture and Chinese culture that could really impact the classroom. And the first one that I found was that in Chinese culture, it's a lot more common to ask personal questions. So they don't see asking like, oh, how old are you? Or, oh, what day is your birthday? Or, what year were you born? They don't see that as much of a personal question as Americans do. So your students might not be as hesitant to share personal things as an American student might be. And another thing is that China is very heavily censored. So I found this a lot with my older students because I teach levels 4 and 5. When I try to reference like pop culture things or maybe like a song that's really popular, they don't really know what I'm talking about. And that's probably because in China, some of the things that are in our pop culture are very heavily censored over there and they don't get as much exposure to it. So you have to keep that in mind constantly when you're talking to students on VIPKid, and you have to kind of adjust and use more universal examples than you might have to use in a traditional classroom. So with all of these differences, you might be thinking, well, how do I transition from a brick and mortar classroom to an online classroom and run it just as successfully as my traditional classroom was? Well, have I got the tips for you? I've come up with 6 tips to help you keep your online classroom just as successful as your brick and mortar classroom. And the first one is professionality. Now, in a brick and mortar classroom, of course, we dressed professional every day. We wore nice clothes. We spoke in a manner that made us sound professional, like we were a trustworthy teacher to learn from. And the same kind of goes for a VIPKid, but you have to project it in a different way because we're in a different format. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get up at 2 a.m. every morning so you have time to take a shower, blow dry your hair, curl your hair, do your makeup, put on some lipstick, wear high heels. No, you're just going to your office or another part of the room or wherever you teach, your laundry room. Who knows? We all teach in weird places, but you're staying home. You can literally teach in your pajamas for this job. So really all you need to worry about is from the waist up, and I would highly recommend that you wear something that kind of matches the company's theme. With VIPKid, this is orange. With other platforms, it might be another color. Let's think about this from a parent's perspective. If you see someone wearing, I don't know, lime green on VIPKid, a lime green polka dot shirt, you might not associate them with the brand as much as you would if they were wearing an orange shirt. So if you see somebody wearing an orange shirt looking like they are part of VIPKid or whatever platform they're teaching on, you are going to be more prone to think that that person is a professional with the company, right? Some people even go as far as getting an orange shirt made with the VIPKid logo on it and their teacher name, which is even better. So if you're already doing that, then you're going above and beyond, and you definitely are probably looking like a professional. So if you maintain that professional look, then that is step number one to maintaining professionality with the students and with the parents, that then they will want to keep coming back. They will trust you to teach their child. They'll be more likely to book you for their child, things like that. Another way to create professionality within the online classroom is very similar to having a brick and mortar classroom, and that is to have a classroom that looks professional. And really, this one's pretty easy. Even if you're not a teacher, even if you don't have a teaching background, think about when you were in school, or if you have kids, think about what their teachers' classrooms look like, especially if you were impressed by them, and kind of try to emulate that. Make sure that you have educational things up. Make sure that you have colorful things in your background, right? Because we're teaching small children, we're not teaching adults. And, they want to feel like they're having fun in the classroom, and colors always make things seem more fun, right? Make sure that your classroom is set up to where you can use things to teach your child or the child, and that you're using props and things to keep them engaged, right? This is very similar to a brick and mortar classroom. But the best thing that I've noticed about VIPKid as compared to a brick and mortar classroom is that it's not as expensive to maintain a professional looking classroom for VIPKid. Literally go to the dollar store, get some decorations, hang them up on a blank wall in your house, put a chair in front of it and a desk where you can put your computer, and you're golden. That's it. You don't have to worry about decorating bulletin boards. You don't have to worry about arranging desks, making name tags, anything like that, like you might in a traditional classroom. And it's a lot less of an investment. Like I said, you can literally go to the dollar store and spend like $10 and you're set with your classroom. So it is pretty easy to maintain a professional looking classroom in the online platform. The third way that you can maintain your professionality within the online classroom is to make sure that you are prepared for your lessons. Now, I know that I've said before, and everybody says that VIPKid lessons are no prep, which is true. You don't have to plan them. You don't have to come up with any materials, but that does not mean that you shouldn't look at them. So the night before I teach, I always look at all of my lessons that I have for the next day, and I make little notes for them just so that it kind of jogs my memory while I'm teaching, and I can look while I'm teaching in order to know where I am, how much I have left, kind of gauge my time right, things like that, so that I maintain a well-organized, well-run class for that student. Now, teaching back-to-back has been kind of a challenge for me, but recently I made what I call my cheat sheet for my classes, which is where I take all my notes from my classes that I'm going to teach the following day. And I actually have this cheat sheet in my Teachers Pay Teachers store for free. So what I did is I printed it out and I laminated it, and I just write on it with wet erase markers for all my classes that day. And then after I write my feedback, I can erase it and do it all again for the next day. So if you want to check that out and you want to give it a try, I will leave the link to my Teachers Pay Teachers store in the description so that you can download it and use it yourself if you'd like. It has really helped me with my professionality, I think, in class, because if you're ever running low on time, or if a student is getting a skill very easily, you don't have to click through all the slides. You can just type in the slide number because you wrote down when that section ends or when the whole lesson ends, and press enter, and you can directly go to that slide without having to skip through all the slides and your student being confused and being like, oh my gosh, why did we skip all this? Blah, blah, blah. So then you are, keeping control of the classroom a little better, not confusing your student as much, and therefore maintaining that professionality. So that is it for the professionality aspect of keeping your classroom successful. The next way to keep your classroom successful is to use visuals. In an online classroom, this is especially important, not just because you are teaching online, so you need to engage them a little more than you would in a traditional classroom, but also because using visuals is very important to ESL teaching as a whole. Students need to associate words and sounds and reading and things that they learn with visuals in order to learn better. So to have a successful online classroom, you need to have good visuals. And the first way that you do that is through props. Props are very important. You don't have to have tons and tons and tons of props. That will come with time as you keep teaching, because you will just kind of accumulate things as you make them along the way. But you do need a pretty good stockpile to start out. So maybe you have some stuffed animals that you can use. Maybe you found some cool clip art online. You can print that out and laminate it and use that as a prop. Or maybe you keep teaching the same lessons over and over again, and you can make your own props for that specific lesson because you know you're going to use them very often. Things like that. I recommend at least having some food and some animals, because those are very popular subjects for VIPKid classes. So you can use actual food. I have used actual food in a lot of my classes. There's actually one class in level 4 where they learn about beans, and I literally have a can of beans sitting on my desk in my classroom just for that lesson because I always use it. So props don't always have to be something fancy or expensive. You can literally find them around your house, but having that visual is going to make your lesson so much more successful, and it's going to make your student remember what they're learning so much better that it is 100% worth it to take the time to get your props out and set them aside and plan which props you want to use for your teaching so that your students are that much more successful. Another way to teach your student visually is by using TPR, which stands for Total Physical Response. And you have heard of this if you've gone through the interview process with VIPKid. They are very big on TPR. It's basically using your hands when you speak. And this is important for the same reason that using props is important. It's so that your students can visualize the words that you're saying, and it helps with understanding. So if you're saying no and you're wagging your finger, they might not know what no means. I mean, that's a pretty simple word, so they might know what no means, but if they didn't, they might see you wagging your finger and be like, oh my gosh, my mom does that when she's angry at me. And they might associate it and then understand what you're saying. Whereas if you weren't wagging your finger, they might not have ever understood that. So it's very important to use TPR when you teach. And this is actually something that I am really interested in, TPR. It's not something that I had to use in the brick and mortar classroom. So I plan to do some research, possibly find a guest that's a little more well-versed in the area and maybe have them on and do a whole podcast on this. So if that's something you guys want to see, make sure that you let me know. But that is it for using visuals in the classroom. So make sure you are using props and make sure you are using TPR. I know TPR might feel a little silly at first, but I promise you, you'll be talking to your husband in a few weeks and you'll be using TPR and it'll be like second nature, and it really does help your students. So it's way worth feeling silly sometimes, maybe roaring like a lion, or, always holding up your fingers when you're talking about numbers, but it's totally worth it. So use TPR and props in the classroom. The third way that you can create the most successful online classroom possible is by using simple language. This is something that I struggled with so much throughout the interview process. So that was their number one critique of my mock classes when I was going through the interview process. And I think it's because, first of all, I'm kind of a fast talker in general, if you haven't noticed through this podcast yet. And also, I was used to teaching older American students, which they have a very good grasp of English and you can talk to them however you'd like and use pretty big words and they can figure it out. So I just wasn't used to using simple language like you need to with English language learners, like you're teaching on VIPKid. So you want to make sure that you don't talk fast. So don't use me in this podcast as an example. You want to make sure that you are talking slowly and clearly. So say, for example, you're greeting your student. You want to say, "Hi, my name is Teacher Brittany. What's your name?" See, I slowed down a lot and I spoke very clearly so that the student could understand me. Another thing that you need to do is make sure you don't use expressions that a student might not understand. So maybe a student breezes through a concept in a lesson and you say, "Oh my goodness, Jimmy, you did that quicker than a dog drinks water on a hot day after a walk." They will probably stare at you and be like, "I have no idea what this woman or man just said to me, but I'm going to smile and act like I did." So that is something that you want to try and avoid because they're not going to get those references, and then that's going to make your lesson less successful because your student won't feel as confident speaking with you because they know that you might say something that they don't understand and they can't respond to. Also, stay aware of the age level that you are teaching. So with VIPKid, you're teaching ages 4 to 12. That's a pretty big age range. So if you're teaching a 4-year-old, your language is going to vary greatly from if you're teaching a 12-year-old. And you need to make sure that you're speaking appropriately for the age level that you're teaching. So if you're teaching a 4-year-old, don't say, "Do you know about, do you know about SpongeBob SquarePants?" They probably won't know. But an older student might because they've had more years to be exposed to things. So make sure that you keep that in mind, and that will also raise your successfulness in the classroom because you're building confidence with your students. They will want to talk with you if you're talking about things that they understand. The fourth way to run your classroom successfully online is to always stay positive and reward often. I always tell people that teaching back to back is hard because by the end of class, my cheeks are literally hurting from smiling. And it's true. Like halfway through my third class, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I just want to frown." Not because I'm sad, but because my cheeks hurt. And I know that it's hard to keep smiling the whole time, but it's really important for you to stay positive. Even if your student is doing terrible in class, stay positive because that will build their confidence level, and then they'll be more likely to learn more in your class and therefore be more successful. Now, sometimes, and I've especially experienced this with my higher level students, so like level 5 students, I call them low-key students. So they'll get on and you'll be like, "Hi, my name is Teacher Brittany. What's your name? It's so nice to meet you." And they'll just be like, hey, basically, that's what they're like. So they are not as excited as the little ones are. And sometimes it can be discouraging, I will admit, but you have to stay positive. And I think that if not the students, then especially the parents appreciate this, and they will be much more likely to book you again because they want their student to be exposed to somebody who is excited about teaching their child and excited about the material and wants to get their student excited. And who knows, you may have a breakthrough one day. You may make that low-key student a high-key student, and then you're doing your job great. So always stay positive, even if you have a low-key student. Now, you also need to remember to reward often, and rewards are actually a big part of the language learning process. That is how students learn a new language. It starts when they're a baby. So if you think about teaching a baby language, when they say a word, we all react. We're like, oh my gosh, yay, you said your first word, good job, right? You want to be the same way with your students on VIPKid or any other language learning platform. When you're excited, they're going to be excited and they're going to want to learn even more. So make sure that you're excited. Make sure you reward them, not only with physical rewards like ice cream cones and gold stars, but also with your words. Make sure you're always reminding them, good job, you're doing great, I'm so proud of you, everything like that. It will make them want to learn even more. And really put yourself in their shoes. I mean, if you were learning a brand new language that you had no idea how to speak, how would you feel? How would you want your teacher to teach you? You would want them to be excited about it, right? Even if you weren't. So make sure that you embody that spirit and make sure that you are just as excited as you want them to be. And most often it'll be reciprocated and allow you to have a much more successful online classroom. Now, my last tip for you guys to have a successful online classroom is to leave good feedback. I am not sure how this works with all of the platforms, but I know that with VIPKid, after every class, you're required to leave what's called feedback. And this is basically information about how the class went that goes directly to the parent. And how a parent can respond is by giving you a good rating. So on VIPKid, they call it a 5-apple rating. And of course, you want that. And leaving good feedback is a great way to communicate with parents and to get them to give you that 5-apple feedback that you want, that increases your teacher reputation and in turn gives you a more successful classroom. So recently, I've done a pretty big revamp on the way that I write feedback, and this is how I do it. So when I'm writing my feedback, I go back into the lesson materials and I copy and paste the objectives and the vocabulary from the materials, and I kind of use that as my beginning template. So if it's a new student, I'll write, it was so great to see, or it was so great to meet, I don't know, John in the classroom today. Today we learned, and then I will put the lesson objective. Our vocabulary words were, and then I'll put the vocabulary words that were in the materials. And then that's it for the first part. Then I will create a new paragraph and I will give the parent information on how the actual class went. Now, most of the time it's positive. It's overall, John did great in class today. And then I make sure to say something that they did especially well. Now, if you have a student who did not do very good, I still encourage you to leave something positive about what happened in the class. So maybe they read one slide really well. I would put that first and then go on to say, I would recommend that they practice this, this, and this. Or, John had trouble with grammar today, something like that. Always praise first and then give them what they need to work on. And that's another really important thing that I make sure to include in my feedback. And that is always some way that the student can keep improving their English skills. So even if the student was like an amazing speaker, I always make sure that I put, at home, I recommend that John keeps reading English books so that he can learn more English vocabulary or something like that, just so that the parent knows that you are looking out for their child's success and you want their child to keep learning at home. So after I give them something for their child to do at home, I always make sure to have a positive ending. So maybe like, I hope that I get to see John in the classroom again soon. And then I make an allusion back to the parent leaving feedback. So I usually type something like, please let me know how John liked class today. And if you'd like to see any changes in the classroom, let me know through the feedback. Another big thing with this feedback is that you have to remember that it is being translated to Chinese, and not everything in English translates correctly. So recently, I have been putting my feedback into a Chinese translator before I submit it. I don't submit it in Chinese, I submit it in English still, but what I do is I put the English words into the translator, I translate it to Chinese, and then I translate it back to English so that then I can kind of see what meanings are lost and what words I should not include or change. And I have a much, much better idea of what the parents are seeing that way, I think. And I got this idea from English Teacher M on Instagram. She did a really interesting Instagram story on it, and it has like changed the whole way that I do feedback. So I will link her profile in the description. But I highly recommend doing it no matter what format you do your feedback in, just because it really does help with the understanding of what you're saying and how certain things translate to the family members that are receiving the feedback. Now, since changing my feedback to translating it so that I can see what translates and what doesn't, I have noticed an increase in 5-apple ratings. A lot of times you'll teach a student and it's not necessarily you receive bad feedback, but you just don't receive any feedback. I think just because the parents aren't motivated to leave any. But if you leave that call to action at the end of your feedback and you make sure that everything that you're writing is translating well, I think it's a lot easier for them to understand, and it makes them want to be involved more. So they're more likely to leave you that 5-apple feedback that you want. So I think from what we've learned from all of these tips that I've shared with you today is that the key to having a successful online classroom is to make your student feel special, to make the parent know that you are invested in their student's education, and to just make learning fun. It's the same kind of thing that you see in a brick and mortar classroom. If you're a student or if you're a teacher and you're sitting at the front of the classroom, like sitting in a chair and being like, okay, turn your books to page 35. Johnny, read paragraph 1. Jimmy, read paragraph 2. You're not engaging your students. They might learn something, but they're not having fun. Now, the difference with VIPKid is that parents are paying for this service, and you want to make sure that they feel like they're getting something special in order for you to be successful. So you need to make sure that you are catering to your students' needs. You need to make sure that you are maintaining professionality. You need to make sure that you're using visuals, using simple language, staying positive, and that feedback is a huge part of it. Don't forget that the feedback is how you communicate with the parents. That is how they know that you are invested in their child's educations. So if you follow those tips, I know that you will have a much more successful online classroom, and it will really ease your transition from brick and mortar to online if you are in that transition like I was when I first started VIPKid. So I hope that you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope that it was helpful for you. If it was, please make sure to let me know. If you have any questions or if you have any other tips, then make sure to let me know that as well. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, there are 3 ways that you can reach out to me. That is through my Instagram, my website, and my email. Those are all 3 linked below, and I'd really love to hear from you. And that is all that I have for you today. So remember to teach regularly, play often, and live your life to the fullest. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.